Well, greetings. It is Tuesday, the 23rd of February, 2021. This is David Gauci. It's only 25 more days until spring. Dave Nagel and I welcome you to the first session of the year in the Business and Energy series of Forum 2100. The mission of Forum 2100 is to explore novel ways that business can address challenges of climate change, improve access to affordable energy, and reinforce energy security. A broad view of the topic today is one that any attempt to navigate an energy transition would have to address. What is in store for the oil and gas sector that has featured so prominently in the industrialization of economies the world over for more than a century? We are delighted to have Nick Butler as our guest today. Nick is the founding chair of the Policy Institute at King's College London, where he also serves as visiting professor. He was formerly Group Vice President for Strategy and Policy, and subsequently was Senior Policy Advisor to British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He now writes regularly on energy issues for the Financial Times and for the Nikkei Asian Review. The topic today is a big topic, and we have heard from several of you requesting to extend the Q&A. And so after Nick's remarks, which will be 15 minutes or more, we shall have the Q&A up to no longer than 12:15 Eastern Standard Time or 6:15 Continental European Time. Please use the chat function to submit questions at any point during the session today, and Dave Nagel and I shall do our best to put them into the queue for Nick to respond to. So, Nick, we are honored to have you as our guest. Thank you for being with us today. The floor is now yours.
David, thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. I hope everybody is safe and well. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm going to be quite brief because I think the real value of this is to have a discussion and to try to answer your questions and your take on board your views. There are many possible views of the world at the moment, and I don't claim to have any monopoly of wisdom. What I'm going to try and talk about is what happened in 2020 for the energy sector and the consequences for the main companies, as David said, the oil and gas companies in particular, which have dominated the scene in the energy market for the last 100 years and more. I'll focus on a few things, but I'm very conscious that there are an awful lot of other topics. What is going on in the US, in Texas, what's going on now in the Middle East or Russia or China. And though I can't claim to be an expert on all those things, I will try to answer questions and give you a view of how they fit into the overall story. If I can have the next slide, David. I think the starting point is COVID. This is the main external item of 2020. Totally unexpected, totally unpredicted and unplanned for. 2 million plus deaths, including 500,000 in the United States. Large-scale lockdowns of the economy, and I'm speaking from the UK, where we are still locked down and will be for another 3 or 4 months, it seems. And that has led across the world, starting in China 12 months ago, but now spreading across almost every country, certainly across the developed world, to a very sharp fall in economic activity. And economic activity is linked quite closely to the demand for energy. The predictions before 2020 began were that the world economy would grow by 2, 3, 4%, depending on what happened in particular countries, and that energy demand would rise by perhaps half that. The one-to-one correlation that used to exist has gone, but you would have expected to see that blue bar at the end, which says total energy demand in 2020, going up by about 2%. And instead, it's come down by 6%. That has affected every form of energy supply. Coal across the world, mainly in Asia, has fallen. Nuclear, because electricity demand varied, particularly in the second quarter of last year, they recovered a great deal. And then renewables, which though they grew slightly in 2020, were expected to grow by significantly more. And of course, the main impact was on oil. And the reason for that is that oil supplies transport and travel and aircraft and freight lorries. And that is what was cut back most because of the pandemic and the lockdowns. Can I have the next slide, please? And the result of that, not surprising, if you take 8 or 9% out of demand, is a falling oil price. The oil price was falling below its historic levels before COVID came because of oversupply. The success of the shale industry in the US, the desire of OPEC to maintain its market share and to keep producing, the imperative of the Russians to keep supplies flowing in order to maintain their national revenue, all those things came together. And we would have seen, if we'd been here a year ago, that that graph was already pointing downwards. But COVID has driven it further down. It collapsed in the spring of 2020 to the point where very briefly prices were negative. People didn't want to be holding the oil. That has changed. There has been an economic recovery. The recovery began in Asia. It has spread into most of the United States, much less into Europe so far. But the price is lower. It is still now not much more than half of what it was 10 years ago or 6 years ago in 2014, 2015. And that has really taken a lot of revenue out of the industry and out of the countries which depend on oil and gas resources. You could do a similar graph of this for gas, which has led to the shut-in of quite a lot of production. And it has had quite a lot of impact on the companies. So could I have the next slide, David, please? And this is the share price. This is the impact over a year from February 2020 to February 2021. The share price, the red and blue lines are Royal Dutch Shell, and the blue line is BP, and the top line is the UK FTSE 100 index. And as you can see, they are these companies, which are major parts of the index, have fallen much more than the index as a whole. Indeed, they've dragged it down. That top line, if you take out the oil companies, would be significantly higher. And the effect of the falling price, the falling demand on the companies has been a loss of revenue, dividend cuts, in some cases for the first time in decades, asset write-offs because their forward valuation, which determines the accounting value of the company, has had to be adjusted. So expectations of future oil prices have come down. And across the industry, this is across the private sector in Europe and the US, $110 billion has been written off asset values by the major companies. Projects have been postponed. There have been tens of thousands of job losses and a decline in valuations. And these share prices show you how much. A 40% decline in 1 year for BP alone. And this is quite a shock for the companies. If I can have the next slide, David. This is the American side of it. This is Exxon in the red line against the S&P 500. So Exxon, a very strong company, down more than 20% despite a rising stock market. And they have not cut their dividend, but they've shrunk in size to the extent that they fell out of the index in the US for the first time ever. First time in history that they have not been in the index. The valuations were written down, but they are slowly coming back. And you see now as the price creeps up above $60 for Brent crude and WTI, that valuations are being restored, but there's still a gap. And we will have to see how strong the post-COVID economic recovery is. That will be the key, because it is actual physical demand for oil that is going to be important. And then it's important whether US shale comes back and whether the OPEC producers are able to are able to maintain their quota system. If everybody goes back to the fight for market share, which existed a year ago, the oil price will find a ceiling, I think, probably at 60 or even possibly below that. So a big change in prices and valuations. But, and could I have the next slide, David? COVID is not the full story, because alongside COVID has come up the agenda the issue of climate change. It was rising 2 years ago because of public campaigns, the Extinction Rebellion campaign in Europe and elsewhere. And it was rising because of the extreme weather, which was drawing people's attention to the sensitivity of their lives to climate, and a link which is not quite proven, but is certainly now widely believed, between climate change and extreme weather events. And what we've seen over the last year is a move from protest movements to long-term commitments. Governments have begun to take this seriously under pressure from the electorate. And there are now around the world 110 countries which, to one degree or another, are committed to net zero emissions by 2050, or in the case of the Chinese, by 2060. Japan, Korea, and China, having resisted these commitments previously, all during 2020 have made those commitments. Now, the commitments are not finished. There are not yet detailed plans of how any of these countries will get there. But the commitments can't be ignored, and they're beginning to be followed by major companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, even now the automakers, ordinary businesses, supermarkets, traders are beginning to commit to reducing their own emissions and then to reducing the emissions of the products they sell. Apple is a good example where they've now, I think, managed to achieve net zero themselves in the energy they use, and they're now beginning to require their suppliers to be net zero as well. And this feeds through the economy. You've seen, and this is a very key point, that after the Trump administration, which did not believe in climate change and didn't think that the US should join global efforts to mitigate it or counter it, we now have a completely different administration in Washington. Mr. Biden, very committed on climate change, with his first act being to commit the US to rejoining the Paris Agreement, which is the global compact set up 6 years ago, to create an international agenda on this. So there is quite a lot of policy momentum. The UK, just to give you one example, has said that it will reduce its emissions by 68% from a 1990 baseline by 2030, which is a very ambitious target indeed. And we have the European Green Deal, which is tied now very much to the post-COVID recovery. Hundreds of billions of euros being spent on developing new sectors, on developing hydrogen as a new source of energy supply, on cleaning up the whole sector, supply and demand. And so this was a year, 2020 therefore was a year of dramatic change in the policy environment, moving from protest to detailed government action, which can only get more detailed. So next slide, please, David. So behind that is the actual story of emissions. And this is the graph, but split out by country as to where the emissions are coming from. They have grown radically over the last 60 years, along with the growth in the world economy and the use of energy. And you see the different colors show where the emissions have grown, particularly, and it's especially China. The 4 decades since 1980 of compound growth of 8-9% a year has used an enormous amount of energy. China is now the biggest energy user in the world, not surprising with a population of 1.2 or 3 billion, but now beginning to have a major impact on the challenge of emissions. Historically, those emissions came from Europe and the United States. Now, the majority of the emissions come from Asia. And that is a significant change. And it is the Asian recovery, which has begun already post-COVID, that will be coal-led, because coal is still the dominant source of energy supply in China, India, Indonesia, and many other emerging economies. And that is likely to continue. There has been a fall this year, but the bounce back, I think, will see that graph rising again. Could I have the next slide, David? This is a prediction from the International Energy Agency, which shows the expectation, this is on pretty modest, reasonable predictions of growth post-COVID, of where energy demand growth will occur in the next decade. It's a reasonable starting point for thinking about where the future is headed. You see the US and Europe on one side of this graph, and Japan, falling demand, energy use becoming more efficient, growth in renewables, that's the green segment, a fall in coal and oil. But on the other side of the graph, a rising demand for all forms of energy in India, and all forms of energy except for some reduction in coal in China. And the growth in energy is the cause of concern when it comes to climate and emissions. The more coal is the most carbon intensive, then oil, and then gas. And unless you can reduce that, unless you can shift the energy mix, the growth in emissions is unfortunately likely to continue. And that growth in demand is not unpredicted. It's driven by two things. It's driven by population growth. We meet for about an hour tonight, this morning. In that hour, there will be another 10,000 citizens in the world. And the second and related fact is that prosperity has spread. Countries like India have taken an awful lot of people out of poverty. They're not rich, but all the studies show that as people come out of poverty, the first thing they spend any disposable income on is energy, for the very basic things which we all take for granted: heat, light, and mobility. And that is why that graph is the most important of all the ones in this presentation. That shows the challenge of the next decade. Can I have the next slide, please? And this shows where we are in terms of the energy mix. What do we use? How do we run our economies now? And as you'll see, it is dominated by oil, coal, and gas. Coal has fallen a little, gas is rising, oil is steady, leaving aside the year of COVID at about 98 to 100 million barrels a day. And you have renewables. Now, renewables are growing very quickly because they're getting cheaper, they're easy to put in place, but they're still only 5% of the total energy supply. And even if you add hydro and nuclear, which is low carbon but expensive, that doesn't add up to the 20%. So the hydrocarbons are still more than 80% of total energy use at the moment. So emissions growth is, and that's where we'll go back to when the COVID recession is over. The story of 2020 is an immediate fall in emissions, but not a structural shift. The change in this picture is going to be slow, and it depends very much on changing the capital stock, the mix of power stations, home heating systems, industrial energy use, how buildings are heated and powered, and the recession has slowed down that change in the capital stock, as recessions always do. And there are hard sectors that we haven't yet learned to penetrate. So renewables, solar and wind are great, but they produce electricity, and electricity is only 20% of the total energy market worldwide and in most countries. And so that is not going to change. We can take a bigger share of the electricity market with wind and solar, and that is going to happen. But there are hard sectors such as freight lorries, aircraft, cement industry, heavy industrial use of power. Those are very difficult to electrify, and we have to find new solutions such as hydrogen, which is possible but still some way off, before we can change those sectors. So then, David, if I can have the next slide. So I looked out to 2030 with the previous one. Now this is another very authoritative international forecast showing the outlook to 2050. And you see renewables, the green line cutting through, very good trajectory, and becoming the largest single source of energy worldwide somewhere in the 2040s. This is all on current policies, current active policies, not the commitments, but which are unsubstantiated by detail, but current policies. But that is growing. But if you look at the other lines, coal, oil, and natural gas all end the period higher in absolute terms than they are today. In some cases, significantly higher. And that is because behind the 110 commitments to net zero, there is just not enough substance as yet. And that is the challenge for the future. So to come to the industry, could I have the next slide? They have a multitude of challenges to face now. They have to adjust to low prices. And though the price will not be as low as it was in the second quarter of 2020, I don't think it's going to go back to the levels of $100 a barrel or more, because there's so much supply, and that supply will compete to get on the market. So the oil companies have to adjust to prices that are probably not going to be much higher than they are now. Secondly, they have to adjust to the fact that the growth in the energy market, the slide I showed earlier, is all about Asia. It is not there in Europe and the US, a saturated market. They have to adjust to the energy transition, to whatever government does now with its policies, country by country. And they have to adjust to the fact that the low carbon activity, and many of them are trying to become lower carbon businesses by getting into wind and solar and other things. There's no sign yet that that is going to be terribly profitable because the barriers to entry are low and an awful lot of people are getting into it. And then they face fading shareholder confidence. The shareholders who've relied on them as the core of their portfolios don't know where they're going. So can I have the next and last slide, David? And that sums up as one chief executive of one of the majors said to me a few weeks ago that his company and the companies generally are needed because oil and gas is still going to be needed, but they're not wanted. And that is a very challenging position for major companies to be in. Do people want to work for them? Do people want to own their shares? Do people want to be associated with them? That's an uncomfortable position. So, David, I've talked too long, but I'm very happy to answer questions.
Well, Nick, thanks very much. Very interesting and provocative. We have questions for you. Let's begin with looking at the companies, the future of the publicly owned oil companies. Obviously, as you've painted the picture here, it seems to be that they do face challenges, particularly at home. And in North America and Europe, there is falling demand for oil and increased regulatory and social pressures. But meanwhile, China, soon to be the world's largest economy, is deepening its relationships with oil-producing countries. Against these headwinds, how do the Exxons, the Shells, and the BPs of the world compete with OPEC, Russia, and now other national oil companies?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it's a great challenge for the companies. And if you know the answer, David, you could get a great job as an advisor to any one of them. They are going to try to become much lower carbon. That means probably in some cases taking the carbon out of the oil and gas that they produce. If they can find good low-cost ways of doing that, they're going to seek to get a substantial business in supplying renewable energy. That's not simple, but they have the ability and the knowledge of the market to do that. I think the landscape of these companies will look very different in 10 years' time. I think some will not be there. This is a real moment of change, as we saw in the communications sector 10 or 20 years ago, and are still seeing. Their position is just not as secure as it was. And I think they will have to do two things over time. One, I think they will have to tie up their business and their knowledge and skills and sources of supply to key users. So partnerships, upstream, downstream partnerships with China and India and other countries, which need the energy they can bring. And secondly, I think you will see them dividing themselves into two different companies in many cases. So Shell producing oil and gas, which is still going to be needed, whether you agree with the details of those forecasts or not. We're going to need a lot of oil and gas, an upstream company like that, and then a separate green company supplying low carbon energy. And that will have probably a different shareholding, different shareholder base. It will have different performance metrics. It will have a different capex profile, and the two can go together. So I think of them as daughter companies. I think they will create them, and then as daughters do, they will inherit. They will take over the business over time. But it's a long-term process. There is not, I know the campaigners want immediate change. It won't come immediately. But I think some of these companies will survive and will lead the transition, but don't expect it to be tomorrow.
Well, to follow on, perhaps this is to go to the net zero issue. That target seems to be acknowledged and adopted around the world. but the graph that you showed on energy supply out to 2050 forecasts that despite the steep rise of the renewables, hydrocarbons, as I think you said, will be well over 80% of the mix for quite some time. What sort of consequences might we expect from such a big gap between expectations and realities? And what does this have to do you think, with the intent to try to march toward a 2 degrees Celsius maximum rise?
That's another very good question, David. I think by 2040, 2050, hydrocarbons will be 70%, maybe a bit less, but that's still an awful lot. And because total energy demand is growing with population, so by then we'll have 10 billion people, that is still an absolute increase in absolute volumes of both oil and gas, and possibly even coal as well. I think there'll be a number of consequences. The first is there will be international conflict over this and real disagreements, because different parts of the world are moving in different ways. I think Europe is way ahead on climate policy and can afford to be, and is now talking, as part of its Green Deal, of having tariff adjustments at the border, measuring the carbon content of imports. So that would apply to steel or cars or cement or anything else coming in from other countries. I'm not sure that's workable. I think it's very damaging for the process of development, and I think they should be doing other things to make things better. But I think that will be a conflict if it's applied to India or China or indeed to the United States. So that's the first consequence. Second, I think there will be increasing pressure from campaigners who see that despite all their efforts and a lot of rhetoric, we're not really moving on a global level towards net zero quickly enough. And if there is this link between climate change and extreme weather, every incidence of extreme weather will be blamed on climate change. And I think the protests will focus against the companies and against governments. So I can see, I think some of the campaigners wrongly feel that the COVID recession has changed the game somehow, and that we're now on a downward track. I'm afraid that is not true. And when they see it's not true, they're going to be quite angry. And then on your point on 2 degrees, I think it's virtually impossible to reach that level now. And I think we have to take very seriously the case for adaptation in areas that are going to be hardest hit, the lowest lying areas. I think it's Singapore that is talking about building a wall around the island, which is something they can do, but not many other people can do. But I think we will have to think about moving developments away from those low-lying areas. We see it already a bit in the UK on housing permissions not being given in floodplains and similar areas. I think adaptation is the next story in this.
Oh, very interesting. We've got a number of questions coming in here, so
yeah, sure.
But the first one, back to your mentioning the possibility of conflicts. I mean, world history seems to be strewn with examples, iconic examples of the competition for access to energy sources that have fueled all kinds of conflicts. Today, if you look at Europe, say Germany and its need for energy, even though it's pushing a very green agenda, it does have this relationship with Russia that is relates to its being supplied with natural gas. Where do you think this is going? Do you think this is going to kind of reset relationships within Europe and possibly between Europe and the United States?
Possibly. I think the Russia-German relationship is very interesting and quite difficult for outsiders to read or understand, because from a UK perspective, we think of Germany as a westward-looking country. I'm not always sure that's true. And I think there are deep links with the Russians. If you look at the graph I put up earlier, you see European demand falling. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a correct forecast. I also think that they are serious about the Green Deal, and they will reduce their use of oil, gas, and coal even further and quite fast. And that means that there will be a fierce competition to supply what continuing use they have for gas or oil. And I know Mr. Trump, when he was in charge, came over to Europe and said that he was going to build 11 new LNG terminals in Europe to receive American gas. I don't think they're going to be built. I think there are multiple suppliers of gas around Europe. There is, of course, Russia, but there's also Norway, Algeria, Nigeria, Egypt now, the Eastern Mediterranean, Central Asia. And the competition for that reducing gas market will be very fierce. And as you said, you can't separate energy from politics. I think the entrenchment of Nord Stream 2, and despite all the bad behavior by the Russians, the fact that the German government has stuck to that through thick and thin is a real sign that it is part of foreign policy as well as energy policy.
Right.
And it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Okay, here back to the issue of migrating from our dependence on hydrocarbons. Could we hasten the transition? And this comes from Jan Dash. How would a substantial price on carbon, for example, $100 per US dollars per ton of CO2, or either a fee or dividend or cap and trade arrangement, how could this affect the conclusions of hastening the transition?
I think it is perfectly possible and indeed quite likely that we'll have something like that in the UK. I think it's possible we'll have something like that in Europe. But we should remember that the UK is only 1.5% of global emissions, and Europe is less than 10% of the whole of the EU. 27 countries is less than 10%. So you can have a very high carbon tax, and you can really drive carbon out in the EU and here. But what really matters for the forecast of emissions is what happens in the emerging economies of the world. China, India, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. That is where the coal is overwhelmingly used. And there, I think the only answer is technology, is finding a source of energy supply that is low cost and low carbon. They could not afford, the Indians, with the best will in the world, could not afford a carbon price of $100 a ton. And there is not yet an immediate substitute for all the coal they use. You have to put in an enormous amount of change in the Indian industry and power sector and this is a growing economy now. You can do it, but that is what will make the difference. That is the front line of this issue now. And I don't see it being solved by a carbon price or by tariffs around Europe. It's got to be solved by giving ordinary people and ordinary businesses in India a low carbon, low cost alternative. Yeah. That's down to technology.
Okay, here's another one from David Edick. The COVID crisis seems to have led to a sharp decline in investment in oil, in particular, outside of shale. So what is the prospect of a serious gap opening between demand and supply in the middle of this decade?
Good question. There is a prospect if that investment continues to be down. I think that the cuts that the companies made were driven at the time when the price was very low in the second quarter of last year when they were cutting dividends. I think now they're beginning to get back to having some projects. I think it would take a sustained period of low investment to get to the point where prices really rose because there is so much supply. There's still an awful lot of potential shale supply in the US, some of which has been cut back over the last year, but it can come back on quite quickly. And if the price rose to 70 or 75 or 80, on it would come. The companies are just waiting to do that. The costs of switching it back on are not that high. Then you have around the world a number of countries which are producing below their potential. So Venezuela is in total chaos, and its production is the lowest in 3 or 4 decades now. But the oil is still in the ground, and that could come back on. Iran has huge supplies of oil and gas, but they're under fairly tight sanctions. There's a discussion going on over the nuclear deal. I think one of the shocks to the market this year could be that Biden administration wants to go back into a deal with Iran very sensibly. But as part of the deal, the Iranians would want to produce more oil, and that would put some more back on the market. So I think as you see prices creeping up a little to a more normal level, you'll see more supply coming on and you'll see more projects for the future. So I think the odds of another sharp spike, they're possible. It's possible, but I don't think they're that high.
Okay. Nick, I think we're probably a little bit out of time, but there are more.
Okay.
And if people can communicate with you, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Very please do. I'll try and answer. If I can, I'll try and answer any questions.
Email address on the website. Well, thank you for all of your questions, members of the audience, and thank you, Nick, for your presentation and your responses. As always, for all of you in the audience, within a day or so, you'll be able to find a recording of this session, including the presentation and the Q&A, on the forum2100.org website and on the Forum 2100 YouTube channel. So please take the opportunity to visit the website to view the archives of all of our sessions. And please pass the word to others you think may have interest in following the work of Forum 2100. Please join us for our next session in 1 month from today, the 23rd of March, when Roger Sorkin returns to Forum 2100. Roger, if you may recall, is the founder and executive director of the American Resilience Project, and he will be screening his recently released film, Nation in Transition, which was produced in collaboration with the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. The film examines the multiple aspects of energy as they impact the Navajo Nation in America. The film runs 30 minutes, and you will have the opportunity to pose questions to Roger after the screening. So please be looking for a formal announcement in your inbox. Again, Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. Dave Nagel and I wish all of you a very happy imminent spring, and thanks for attending the session today. We'll see you on the 23rd of March. That's 3 days after the formal springing of spring. Bye for now.